Let's talk about a recent paper retraction that is relevant to many of you who follow my channel. This is a retracted clinical trial that tested prednisone for Gulf War illness. Now, I usually don't talk about article retractions, but they're an important part of the integrity of scientific research, so it's worth covering every once in a while. Now, sometimes a retraction is due to scientific misconduct, such as falsification of data, but not always. Sometimes the authors themselves will request a retraction if they discover a large enough error and if they want to rework the data and resubmit the paper. But whatever the case, you never want to have a retraction because the papers stay up with retracted or retraction printed in big red letters, and it just doesn't look good for the researchers involved. So let's take a look at this particular study and the new retraction of that study. And by the way, I'm not involved with the paper or the study or the retraction process in this case. So this article is Gulf War Illness Inflammation Reduction Trial, a phase 2 randomized controlled trial of low-dose prednisone chronotherapy, effects on health-related quality of life. And this is from two scientists at the Minneapolis VA, or Veterans Administration Hospital. And this is a clinical trial of Gulf War illness, and Gulf War illness involves oftentimes pain, fatigue, and cognitive issues. And these are veterans of the 1991 Persian Gulf War. And the clinical trial, as I mentioned, is testing prednisone. Now, prednisone is a corticosteroid with very potent anti-inflammatory effects. And this research team found in their prior work that people with GWI oftentimes showed evidence of pro-inflammatory activity, such as elevated cytokine interleukin 6. So they believed, or they hypothesized, that Gulf War illness would respond to prednisone because prednisone can knock down that systemic inflammation. That's a logical hypothesis. I find inflammation in Gulf War illness as well, almost any time I test it. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, they used a modified form of prednisone that releases the drug early in the morning, and that's when inflammatory activity is typically at its greatest. And this is a chronotherapy approach. And you typically see this used with rheumatoid arthritis, because in rheumatoid arthritis patients, their inflammation is usually really bad when they first wake up. And so this is a way to deal with that, with the anti-inflammatory activity occurring before you even wake up. So the trial enrolled 83 individuals with Gulf War illness. 42 of them were given prednisone for 8 weeks, and 41 of them were given placebo. And this was blinded, so they didn't know which one they were getting. Now, because the study is retracted, I'm not going to go over all the details, but if you want to see those, you should be able to access this paper still, despite the fact that it's been retracted. So I'm putting the links in the description below, and you should be able to get a hold of this if you want to see what the research team originally tried to do and what they found. But the bottom line in terms of the original report is they reported that the prednisone significantly increased physical functioning after 8 weeks of treatment, which basically means the individuals were able to do more, and so they improved. And so the research team concluded that prednisone should be tested in a larger phase 3 study, which involves hundreds and hundreds of participants. And that's all good, but there was a problem, or maybe a few problems. One of the initial problems is that while the prednisone group got better, the placebo group also got significantly better, even though they didn't receive a real treatment. And that raises the question, what's going on here? Now, someone, and I don't know who, reported concerns after the paper had already been published. And this led to an investigation by the Veterans Administration, or the VA system. And the claim was that the authors changed their statistical analytical approach. The original plan was to do a statistical test directly comparing the two groups to see if prednisone was better than placebo. And that's what you typically see in a clinical trial. But that test didn't reach statistical significance. And by the way, that original plan wasn't reported in the paper at all. It was omitted from the paper. And so we didn't get to see that that test didn't reach significance. And then it appears that after that main test didn't reach statistical significance, the authors changed to a different approach where they don't directly compare prednisone and placebo. It's an alternative way of analyzing the data. And so the authors, or at least one of the authors, were accused of running an inappropriate statistical test and not properly disclosing the change to the analytical plan. Now, in my read of everything, the paper, the retraction notes, the associated materials, I do agree with the concerns that were raised. As scientists, we are supposed to register our trial and our analysis plan before we start, and we're supposed to stick with that plan. And that's really important because if we start getting in there and running tests in all these different ways, the chances of us having a false positive rise significantly. So we should propose an analytical approach and we should stick to it. And that way we can be sure that the tests we do is as we intended. We can't be putting out bad information with clinical trials. It's really, really important that the plan is vetted and that we keep to it because, if we put out bad information, this is, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to think of here is with any scientific experiment, it's really important to stick with your plan. But for clinical trials, it's even more important because this information and these trials are used by doctors to decide how they're going to prescribe and what they're going to do with their patients. And so we really, it's bad for any science to be wrong. But when it comes to treatments and things that are given to patients, we really have to get it right, or someone can get hurt. Now, we are allowed to run exploratory analyses that we didn't originally plan, but we can only do that after we report the original planned tests. And we have to clearly mark any additional analyses as exploratory. And that was not done here. And that's the problem. Now, the tests that they ran, I'm not going to go into the stats. It'd probably take 10, 20 minutes to properly describe, but the test they ultimately ran in the paper, it could have been appropriate. It's not that the test is wrong if they would have planned to do that from the beginning. And that's because what you generally see in clinical trials is a between group test, like between treatment and placebo. And even though that's the classic way of doing it, it actually takes hundreds of people to do that properly, or you don't have enough statistical power and you'll get a non-significant result, even if the treatment works, because you don't have enough people. 80 people, which is what they had in this study, that is rarely enough to have statistical power for a between group analysis. There are other tests that are better suited for smaller sample sizes like this. So again, it's not that what was done was necessarily wrong, but it was definitely not properly reported. I see, looking through the data, there seems to be an interesting signal here, and there does seem to be some at least preliminary evidence that this could benefit some patients. And again, looking at the data, I'm guessing that if they had run the study with 1 to 200 people in each arm, like 1 to 200 people receiving prednisone and 100 to 200 people getting placebo, and then compared between those conditions, there's a good chance they would have had a statistically significant difference because the trend is there. They just didn't have enough statistical power. I don't see any evidence that the data were fabricated or altered. It's more that the testing process was not transparent to readers, and it has to be. Regardless of the intention, the journal was alerted to the problems, and after a discussion and a debate among the editors and the statisticians, they decided to retract the paper, and the VA accused the lead author of misconduct. Now, there was some disagreement about how large the problem was and if it warranted a full retraction among the editors. And I should note that the lead author maintains that the paper analytical plan is legitimate and the paper should not be retracted. Now, my quick thoughts, first of all, it makes sense that prednisone would help a subgroup of Gulf War illness individuals, just like if I took 100 people randomly with chronic pain and fatigue, a subset of them would probably also benefit from prednisone. But there's no convincing evidence that I can see that a Gulf War illness diagnosis itself should be used to indicate prednisone therapy. Rather, I think classic signs and test results should be used to indicate prednisone, and those tests should indicate that there was an inflammatory or an autoimmune disorder. Things like erythrocyte sedimentation rate and C-reactive protein, positive rheumatoid factor. There's several antibody titers that can be used, and just the symptom presentation. Those can all be used to give the doctor a good clue that there's some kind of autoimmune or autoinflammatory or inflammatory disease that would likely respond to prednisone. And those should be used instead of a Gulf War illness diagnosis, because the majority of people with Gulf War illness, they don't show enough inflammation, I think, to warrant using prednisone long term. And if you give prednisone to someone who doesn't need it, the side effects are going to significantly outweigh any benefits. Which, by the way, as an aside, unless I missed something, there was no mention anywhere in this paper about the side effects and the adverse events, which is very concerning to me. And just admitting that information alone would be enough for me to reject the paper if I were one of the peer reviewers, which I wasn't. Anyway, so at this time, we cannot recommend that Gulf War individuals look into prednisone therapy for their Gulf War illness. Now, if they have signs of inflammation or autoimmunity, there are dozens of drugs that target those types of issues, and that's best decided by your primary care physician and probably a rheumatologist. So it's unfortunate that a clinical trial was retracted because there are so few of them in Gulf War illness and myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia and long COVID. I hate to see one of them taken away, but it shows us that the overall scientific review process is working. It's critical that physicians and patients can rely on clinical trials to give the information that's needed to make wise treatment decisions. And clinical trials, as I mentioned before, more than any other type of experiment, they have to be closely evaluated, maybe even ruthlessly evaluated, because we can't afford to get it wrong when people are making decisions about what they're going to take daily. We have to get that right. So anyway, stay tuned to this channel. I'll continue to cover the clinical trials as they come out. Hopefully, I won't have to cover a retraction for a long time, but I will keep you up to date regardless. So thanks for watching.